Tanya Plibersek, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Barry.
Is Bill Shorten and Labor treating this as a coronation?
Well, absolutely not. But of course, I'm not surprised by anything that Scott Morrison says. It's been a pretty desperate campaign for him, full of lies about Labor's policies. And the reason he's lying about our policies and disparaging Bill in this way is because he's got nothing positive to say. I've been actually really worried that this campaign is probably the dirtiest and the most negative in my 20 years of politics. And given that we've still got 3 weeks to go, I guess I'm worried about how much lower Scott Morrison will go. He's made all the cuts and chaos that we've seen in recent years, and then in the last few days, these deals with Clive Palmer, the National Party's doing deals with One Nation. So they're focused on, running a negative line on us because they've got nothing positive to say about themselves. They can't run on their record. It's cuts and chaos. They can't run on their vision for the future. They haven't got one. They can't run on unity and discipline because they've still got Tony Abbott and Barnaby Joyce waiting in the wings to be drafted back into leadership roles. All
right, we'll get back to certainly the Clive Palmer issue a little later on, but just on the way that the two leaders are campaigning, far from a coronation, a lot of the analysis is that Bill Shorten hasn't been as sure-footed as Scott Morrison, and in fact it's Scott Morrison who has most of the energy in this campaign.
Well, I think that's absolute nonsense. I've been campaigning with Bill not for the last 2 weeks, but for the last 6 years. We've been travelling all over Australia, talking to people and listening to them about what would make a difference to their lives. And throughout this campaign and throughout the last 6 years, people have been telling us that the biggest problem they've got is that their wages aren't keeping pace with the cost of living. They're really struggling to make ends meet. That's why we're focusing on better schools and hospital, investment in childcare, other policies that make life better for working people, not more tax breaks at the top end of town. This really is a choice when it comes to the election between Bill Shorten and Scott Morrison, but also between a Labor Party that wants to have the world's best schools and hospitals, or a Liberal Party that wants bigger tax loopholes for the top end of town.
And if we look at the childcare policy that's being announced today, of course, it does come down to that, doesn't it? It's your biggest spend, but it's paid for through higher taxes.
Well, it's paid for because we don't want to see the continuation of tax loopholes that disproportionately benefit people on really high incomes and big multinational companies. Yes, this is about choices. We've made some very tough choices. We've, of course, said that we'll restrict negative gearing, for example, to new properties while we're grandfathering people who've already existing have properties already. We're grandfathering them. We've made tough decisions in other areas as well, and that allows us to invest in childcare. It means that we can have the same tax cuts or bigger tax cuts for 10 million working Australians. It means we can invest in better schools and hospitals. Our cancer package has been phenomenally well received. Everywhere I travel, people tell me stories about the out-of-pocket expenses they or a family member has faced. We can do all of that. We can pay down debt sooner because we're not going to continue with these unaffordable tax loopholes.
You talk about offering a bigger tax cut, but that's at the lower end. Have you done any calculations to work out whether those in middle and higher incomes would be better off with the Coalition's tax cuts rather than your childcare subsidies?
For 10 million working Australians, we have the same or a bigger tax cut. For people up to $48,000 a year, we've got a bigger tax cut under Labor. In addition to that, families up to $174,000 a year will be better off under Labor's childcare subsidies as well, increased childcare subsidies. We want to take the pressure off working families. We know that people are facing higher out-of-pocket expenses in healthcare, private health insurance is going up, power bills are going up, childcare costs are going up, and wages have flatlined. Barry, one of the biggest risks to our economy is the fact that wages aren't growing. It's really causing a decline in consumer confidence. There's less money in the economy. people aren't going to go and buy a cup of coffee on the way to work if they're not confident that their wages are going to keep pace with inflation. They're not going to take the kids out for pizza on a Friday night if they don't know whether they're going to have a job next week or what they're going to be paid. This insecurity in our economy, the historic low wages growth, are having an impact across the board, and people are talking to us about it everywhere we go. They need relief from cost of living pressures. We need bigger tax cuts at the lower end. In what world is it fair that under the government's proposal, someone on $500,000 a year will get an $11,000 a year tax cut, and an ordinary worker on $40,000 a year will get $11 a week?
Right.
It's just not fair, and it's not right.
One aspect of the childcare policy that we discussed previously, if you offer subsidies to 100%, is that not an encouragement then to the childcare centres to charge more?
It's very important that we work with the ACCC both to pick up individual instances of childcare centres price gouging or inflating their prices unnecessarily, but we also want to work with the ACCC to look across the childcare industry to make sure that we make the reforms that are necessary to prevent inflation in childcare. We've seen a 28% increase in recent years under this government in childcare costs. Families can't afford to see increases beyond that. We want to make sure that every dollar of this extra $4 billion that we're putting into early childhood education and care goes to families, not to childcare centre operator profits.
All right, just on your portfolio now on education, can you confirm that, given that you're Deputy Leader and if you were to win the election, I think you get the choice of a portfolio, will you stay in education?
Yeah, I love it. It's a terrifically interesting portfolio because we get to make a huge difference to the lives of individual people, but it's also such an important economic driver of Australia's success. If we want to be a high-wage, high-skill economy, we need to have the best education system in the world.
Well, can you help sort this out? Because I think the public get very confused with what they hear, that you say the government is actually cutting education funding. The government insists funding is at record levels. How can that be?
Yeah, well, in fact, the government says they're cutting funding to education. If you look at the 2014 budget paper, page 7 of the budget overview, they've got a graph that shows $30 billion difference between what they're proposing to spend. Yes, OK. Well, 2017, Malcolm Turnbull's changes to education funding, the document he distributed to journalists shows a $22 billion difference between Labor's spending and what the government was spending. Of course, they've restored funding to Catholic and independent schools, so the cut exists now for public schools. There's a $14 billion difference between what Labor will spend over the next decade and what the Liberals will spend, and people can check on our website, Fair Go for Schools funding website, what their own school will get.
But that's not the same thing.
Their own school will be.
Just to give that Malcolm Turnbull example, that to say that they are not spending as much as you plan to spend is not the same as cutting.
No, it's not. It's not the same as what we plan to spend. It's what they promised states, what they promised parents. When they said you could vote Liberal, you could vote Labor, there'd be not a dollar difference in your school funding. States and territories had signed agreements with the federal government that this government walked away from. The cost of that is $14 billion over the next 10 years. If they had stuck with what they promised states and territories, schools would be $14 billion better off over the next 10 years, and that's what Labor will restore. And Barry, when you say in your budget paper that you've got a $30 billion saving, or when you distribute a document to journalists that says you've got a $22 billion saving, a saving is a cut, is a saving is a cut. When the government describes changes to education funding as a saving, they are saying that they have cut school funding.
All right, if we can get on to Clive Palmer now, that you mentioned a little earlier. Clearly it seems that even perhaps at an unofficial level, but there were approaches from the Labor Party to Clive Palmer?
Look, I don't think a couple of SMSs is what you'd call a formal negotiation, and Bill's made it very clear that we would never have had a formal arrangement with Clive Palmer while he owes his workers $70 million. And don't forget, he's now confessed to his own candidates that he will probably spend $70 million promoting himself on the side of every bus, on the side of every building around Australia. He can find the money to put his own face on any billboard that's vacant and available, but he cannot find the money to properly pay his workers in Queensland Nickel. I mean, the problem is not Clive Palmer. We've always known that he is lazy, that he only turned up to 25 votes out of the 400 last time he was in Parliament, that he fell asleep in Parliament. We know all about that for Clive Palmer. The real problem is, why is Scott Morrison doing a deal with him? Why isn't Scott Morrison saying that Clive Palmer should pay back his workforce and pay back the taxpayers that have had to bail out his workforce?
But aren't people entitled to say why a couple of text messages anyway? Why were they sent in the first place?
Because parties talk to parties all through election campaigns constantly.
With the intention of getting their preferences. And so are you in a position to criticise?
And sometimes with the intention of finding out just what your opponents are planning to do. I don't think a couple of text messages is the same as entering into a formal negotiation with Clive Palmer and doing a deal. What's in it? What's in it for Clive Palmer? You know that Clive Palmer is only ever about Clive Palmer. What has he extracted from Scott Morrison to get this deal?
Do you think
Scott
the
Morrison
government
is so desperate in this Scott Morrison is so desperate in this campaign. He's lying about Labor policies and he's doing deals with minor and right-wing parties that will cause chaos in the Senate if they're elected.
Do you think they now have an advantage in some of those Queensland seats?
Well, that's yet to be seen. I think Clive Palmer will come under increasing scrutiny during this campaign, and people will ask themselves why they would vote for a man who dudded his own workers. I don't want to see him do to the Senate what he's done to the Hyatt Coolum. Last time he was in the Parliament, he started with, 3 members of Parliament, and he ended with 3 different political parties. This man is a walking disaster when it comes to democracy, and why Scott Morrison would allow Clive Palmer to take his hopeless work ethic and his questionable policies back into the Australian Senate, well, you'd have to ask Scott Morrison what exactly he's been offered.
Just finally on the debates, 2 agreed to. One is on Channel 7's second channel. The other one is on Sky. And the one that might go to air on free-to-air is at lunchtime. Is this some sort of unity ticket between the leaders to take the pressure off themselves?
No, I think it's just a bit hard to schedule all the debates you get invited to. But don't forget...
But what about one at prime time, that everybody can watch?
Well, I think with streaming services, Barry, you'll find that most people watch TV whenever they want. But we're talking about 3 debates. That's the same as the last election campaign. And don't forget, Bill Shorten's doing full court press conferences every single day. He's done more than 80 town hall visits. We're out talking to people every day of the week in electorates right across Australia. I think you'll find that he'll answer many, many questions during this election campaign, as no doubt will Scott Morrison. One of the questions I'd ask is why Scott Morrison's ministers aren't allowed to participate in debates. I wrote to Dan Tehan, the Education Minister, months ago, asking for a debate. He's refused that. Melissa Price, the Environment Minister, she's not even allowed to do press conferences anymore. She's well hidden during this campaign. So, yes, I mean, it's great to see as many leaders' debates as we can schedule, but I'd like to see some ministerial debates as well.
All right, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you, Barry.